Hello and welcome to The Economists. I'm Peter Martin.
And I'm Gigi Foster. Hello.
Gigi, I think it's fair to say that no one enjoys being locked in their homes, and no one enjoys being locked in the country, however much they like their country or their home. But one sort of good thing that's come out of it, at least in a research sense, is an opportunity to see what would happen if we closed our borders. Many people have been saying for years we've had too much immigration. Now we get a chance to see what happens when we have none.
In fact, I've been hearing some people saying that the picture so far looks pretty good. Unemployment is down to an unexpectedly low 4.9%. And their story goes that without competition from new arrivals, more and more pre-existing Australians are getting jobs.
They are indeed on the figures at an astonishing rate. Just since the start of this year, 250,000 jobs, 285,000. That's 47,500 per month, a blistering rate we haven't seen since the mining boom.
Of course, latest lockdowns may put a bit of a dampener on the jobs market, and we won't know about that until the new figures come out.
Yeah, actually, I reckon there's a delay of a month. You sort of get a feel of these things. There's usually, it's like the second shoe dropping. Employers don't let go of people straight away. But even the figures we've seen are not all they seem. You remember last week we were talking about employment, and I said that temporary workers, people who've been here less than a year, are excluded from the count of jobs in the monthly employment survey. Those jobs weren't counted. But now they're being counted because they're being done by Australians who've permanent residents and so on, because the temporary arrivals, many of them have left. And it means the figures look as if jobs are being created when they were actually there.
So basically you're saying, Peter, that the natives have taken the immigrants' jobs.
Yes, but there's always to and fro. But what's happening is that jobs are being counted that weren't. Now, I'm not saying that the closed borders haven't helped employment. That's a subject we'll get to later in the program. It's a very timely program devoted to the economics of immigration. Merely that the way the figures are counted has created an artefact that's overstating reality.
Timely is indeed the word. In fact, never in my lifetime have we been able to see what happens when we effectively stop immigration. It's an opportunity to assess in very stark terms how important immigration really is to Australia.
Yeah, before the boom gates came down, we had a net. This is a net, arrivals greater than departures, 244,000 people coming per year, something close to a record. Now, whether or not the border restrictions are necessary, and I know you have your view, Gigi, this pause gives us an opportunity to assess what's happening. We're at zero at the moment, slightly less than zero, actually. We've got slightly more people going out, Queensland premiers at the Olympics and so on. But we're at zero at the moment, and the intergenerational report predicts that we'll go back up to 235,000 or more. The question is, should we do that? Should we have more? Should we have less? Before we bring in our guests, expert economists who know what's known about the effect of immigration on Australia, let's set out the questions we want answers to. Does immigration help or hurt employment? Does immigration help or hurt wages? Does it help or hurt living standards? Does it help or hurt the environment? Does it enrich or impoverish society and social cohesion?
And the answers depend a lot on the kind of immigration system we've got. Yeah. Australia's system, as you know, Peter, is very different to the one in my home country of the US, which has traditionally favoured low-skilled arrivals. Ours, by contrast, is skewed towards arrivals with skills, extremely skewed that way compared to the systems in many other countries.
Oh, yes. Although our system is two things at once. We've got the permanent system, permanent migrants, and that is these days laser-like focused to those with skills, perhaps more so than any other country. We get total value in that we get people who are pre-trained. 80% of them are under the age of 35 when they arrive, and they have skills in computing, skills in accounting, things we don't have enough of. The family reunion component has been shrinking. It's almost impossible to come in now. If you want to expedite a request for a parent visa, you have to pay $47,700 and it'll it'll take 5 years. But if you don't expedite it, it'll take 30 years, which is, shall we say, a bit too old for a number of parents. We also have the humanitarian program, which is big as a proportion of the population, although small compared to the other program. The other side of things, though, are temporary arrivals. Now, some of these are temporary skilled migrants. A lot of them are unskilled in those sort of educated sense. They're people who are working while they're students, they're farm workers, they're holiday makers. In a sense, though, they're skilled too, because they do work that Australians won't easily do, work in abattoirs, work on farms, things like that. It's a sort of a two-faced system.
Okay, so Peter, the question many of our listeners are going to be asking is, how does migration benefit us, if it does at all?
At the risk of offending some people, I've got to say that it depends on who us is, and that's only half the question. If by us you mean people who are already here. I don't want to sound as if I am on a soapbox, but there are two parties to this transaction, as there are to any trade. The other side of the transaction are the people who come here. Immigration is clearly a net positive, a big positive, otherwise they wouldn't be coming here. And that matters too. So it's all very well to talk about, does it help the jobs or help the wages of people who are here? Assume that it did nothing. Assume that it was roughly balanced. It would still be a big positive for the people who come here, and that means it would be worth having.
Yeah, no, indeed. The makeup of Australia changes hugely over time as we take people in and let them out, at least in normal times. And if we care about Australia in the abstract, then inevitably we care about people who aren't here yet, but will be one day.
And by the way, this is the whole ethos of the intergenerational report, caring about people who are not yet here.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
We're caring about generations not yet born, and we regard that as a reasonable thing to do.
But still, pre-existing Australians, including many of our listeners probably, who are looking after their own interests, and maybe those of the kids they expect to stay here, will care about their jobs and their wages, living standards, the environment here, social cohesion, and how immigration changes all of this.
They're questions worth answering.
This is The Economists on RN with me, Gigi Foster, and Peter Martin, and we're about to be joined by two other economists able to sketch the dimensions of these answers. We've hit pause on immigration. Is there a payoff from restarting it?
Joining us now is Gabriella De Souza, who specialises in immigration as a senior economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. And like many of us eco-nerds, has suddenly found her work incredibly topical. Gabriella, thanks for taking part.
Thanks, Peter.
What's the evidence on jobs first? Do immigrants take or create jobs, or have I asked too simple a question?
Yeah, look, it's complex, but we have a lot of research on this topic. So a lot of our research initially comes from the US, where they've had a long history of waves of migration. We know that immigrants, while supplying labour, also create demand for goods and services. That's a well-established fact. And so, what we see is that in the US and even in Australia, when we've had waves of migration in the past, we've seen no harmful effects on the wages or the employment levels of local workers.
I guess it depends on who the local workers are, though. So that might be true overall, but would, for instance, a new wave of computer specialists have harmful effects on the wages of computer specialists, while at the same time perhaps boosting the wages or boosting the employment of people who work in cafes and so on, serving them?
Yeah, look, it's possible that there are some areas where we do see some suppression of wages, particularly in that high-skilled part of the labour market, where there's an immense demand, wages might skyrocket and then mediate back down to their original equilibrium levels, if you will, once migrants are able to fill that job, or even once, we see from a lot of our members that migrants are able to come in and further projects which create employment for Australians in the workforce as well. That's a kind of very partial equilibrium analysis if we're just looking at it in terms of...
You better explain two things. One, your members are members of the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, and the other is partial equilibrium.
Yes, so CETA is a member-based organisation, and our members are mostly Australian companies. And so what we see with a lot of our members is that some of them bring in migrants, and those migrants end up furthering projects and creating more jobs for Australians in the workforce. Something that I've observed in the economics commentary around this issue is a very one-dimensional look at this issue. I think what we're missing is that more broader look, what economists call general equilibrium, as opposed to what I'm seeing at the moment, which is a very partial equilibrium where we only look at the effects on one segment of the labour market and we don't look at the broader effects.
Because that's easier. That's what we can see. Now, the Governor of the Reserve Bank just the other week waded into this. He said the inflow of temporary workers might actually be holding back wage growth and that might have broader effects. Here's what he said.
Immigration adds to both the supply of and the demand for labour. The picture, though, is clearer when firms are hiring workers to overcome bottlenecks and fill specific gaps where workers are in short supply. This type of hiring dilutes the upward pressure on wages in these hotspots, and it's possible that there are spillover effects to the rest of the labour market.
He seems to be saying there that temporary migration can hold back wage rises, although, to be fair, he might be deflecting from his own problem, which is desperately trying to get wage rises up and not so far succeeding. But he goes on to say there might be spillovers to the rest of the labour market. Do you agree?
Look, I won't comment on the performance of the RBA. I think that's been pretty well covered by other economists who are far more knowledgeable than I am. But I will say that empirically, we just don't see the kind of effects that the governor is talking about. In Australia, we've seen a paper that was commissioned by the Productivity Commission to look at this issue, and they found no evidence of harm on local workers from the arrival of migrants. And in modelling that I did in 2019, I found similar results using more recent waves of data.
So that's talking about levels of wages. Another thing that a lot of us care about is inequality. Is there any evidence about whether higher immigration improves outcomes on inequality, makes wages more equal or possibly less equal?
Look, it's still a bit unclear. What we know is that, it doesn't harm the outcomes and the wages of local workers. And we also know that immigration does add to productivity levels in the economy. And we know that one of the biggest sources for wage growth in the economy will be productivity.
How can immigration add to productivity? On the face of it, that needn't be the case. You can cut Australia in two, we'd have half the number of people, but there's no particular reason, is there, to think we'd be more productive. Yes, productivity is a source of wealth, but how can immigration make it happen?
Well, just by virtue of having a larger population does help to increase our levels of GDP. But there's also other aspects that, there are aspects that economists so far in Australia just haven't been able to measure. And this is around what they call the productivity spillover benefits from migration. So that's the kind of know-how and the expertise that immigrants are able to bring into Australia that we would not have ordinarily had without them.
So I want to bring in an idea that's very important in economics, which is complementarity, and in particular complementarity in skills in the labour market. And the idea here is that some things, when you produce them, really require input from different types of skills. So you may need a high-skilled person to combine his labour with a low-skilled person in order to produce a particular thing. And if we bring in some high-skilled immigrants that we don't have enough of here, those skills aren't here in Australia enough, then maybe that allows us to, produce that thing, and therefore helps that lower skilled Australian to get a job, because employers will then say, oh yeah, now I have the low and the high skilled workers that I need to produce this widget. Is that something that you think might be going on?
Yes, 100%. I think one of the issues with this debate around higher skilled migration is that I think we ignore that we need skills at all ends of the spectrum. And there are definitely labour complementarities that come in from bringing high-skilled workers, but we also need that level of skill at other levels of the spectrum as well.
Are there particular sectors or particular occupations that we've seen immigrants recently in the last, say, 10 years or so able to fill really well? I mean, IT skills is one that we are, hearing a lot about in the news as being really scarce.
Yeah, so IT skills is a really important one. Obviously, university lecturers, Gigi, is another that we've noticed that the industries that really heavily use skilled migration They're those high-skilled workers around IT and in the university sector as well.
Might it be that there's a complementarity even in social knowledge? The Curtin Institute has done research pointing to this, which is that Australians know a lot about Australia, right? And it's important. You can't get around unless you know about Australia. But if they bring in someone, Gigi, a university lecturer from overseas, or bring in someone who is an expert in food technology, that person ain't going to be managing the project to start with because they don't understand how Australia works. So an Australian who was doing that job is likely to get promoted to be their manager. This, by the way, doesn't show up in the aggregate wage figures, but the complementarity is that the project will exist, mightn't exist without the new arrival, and the pre-existing Australian might in fact be doing that cultural translation stuff.
And not only that, but also, right, there's an impact on, again, not just the demand for labor, because immigrants buy things, right? They're people. And because they buy things, they add to the aggregate demand for goods and services here. And that makes employers feel like, oh, we need to hire more people so we can make the stuff that these new people want to buy. But also, it's going to increase tax revenues, right? So particularly when immigrants come here fully formed with lots of skills and just able to start earning immediately, they bring in a lot of money and they've got to give a share to the Australian government. So there are these really positive effects as well.
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the intergenerational report that was released recently that, permanent skilled migrants, the primary applicants, add about $319,000 to the tax coffers on net across their lifetime. And, going back to the point earlier about the kind of jobs that migrants might allow local workers to specialise in, we do have a study in Australia that looked at the influx of temporary skilled workers and found that it induced native workers to specialise in occupations that had a high intensity of communication and cognitive skills. So we do see some, positive effects for the Australian labour market.
So then the question is why, at least until the latest lockdowns, have the economic figures been looking so good even with zero immigration? Have closed borders somehow bought us more jobs, more spending, and maybe even upward wage pressure? Saul Eslake has some answers, and they harken back to an earlier time. Saul produces a weekly briefing on the economic impacts of the coronavirus, and as former chief economist for the ANZ Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch in Australia, and now Carina Economic Advisory based in Hobart, he knows his way around the workings of the economy. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Gigi. Thanks for having me on today.
So what can possibly explain the rosy figures we've been seeing coming out of this period? Do they hide something more sinister in the longer run?
Well, I'm not sure I'd say sinister, but what I think's going on can be traced to side effects of the very tight closure of Australia's borders to movements in both directions. On the one hand, Australians who, had they been free to do so, would have spent in excess of $50 billion per annum overseas, have instead been spending those amounts or more on their homes, in their homes, on cars, and in other ways that have added to domestic demand and indirectly helped create employment. At the same time, the fact that very few people are allowed into the country means that fewer people are competing for the available jobs than would normally have been the case. So, for example, on average, over the 10 years to the onset of the pandemic, Australia's civilian working age population was growing by about 26,000 a month. That means with an unchanged participation rate, you need to create at least about 16,000 new jobs a month in order to get the unemployment rate to fall over time. But since the onset of COVID, with the closure of our borders, the civilian working age population has been growing at an average of less than 10,000 a month. And that means all else being equal, including the participation rate, we only need to create about 6,000 new jobs a month on net for the unemployment rate to go down. Now, so far this year, that is starting with January, Australia's actually created an average of 47,000 new jobs a month, which is why the unemployment rate has fallen faster than anyone had anticipated. If we kept doing that until June next year, when the budget papers assume that the borders will be reopened, the unemployment rate would actually get down to 1.3%. Now, I don't think we're going to keep creating jobs at 47,000 a month, not least because of the lockdowns that are now going on in Sydney, Melbourne and some other parts of Australia. But if, for example, we manage to create jobs at half that rate, that is just under 24,000 a month, then the unemployment rate would be down to 3.5% by June next year. If we did it at a quarter of the rate that we have been doing, that is about 12,000 a month, then, and I think that's quite feasible, then the unemployment rate would be less than 4.5% by June next year, which is the sort of territory that the Reserve Bank and the Treasury have identified as being roughly consistent with full employment, a level at which you might expect eventually wages growth to start picking up. So that all sounds good. The point I make is that in many ways, this state of affairs resembles the protectionism that was the hallmark of Australian economic policy from the time of federation at the beginning of the 20th century until about 1990.
By protectionism, you mean?
Well, what I mean by protectionism is that for the best part of 90 years, successive Australian governments of all political persuasions in effect forced Australians to spend more than they would have freely chosen on what were often poorly made goods in Australia simply because they were made in Australia in order to create jobs in Australia. And we call that protection, and probably that word was chosen because protection is something that sounds nice. It's hard to argue against. What could be wrong with creating jobs, especially in manufacturing? So Australians were obliged by their government through tariffs and quotas to spend money on Fords and Holdens when they might have preferred to buy Toyotas and Mazdas or BMWs if they could afford it. They were forced to pay higher prices than they would have otherwise for Australian-made refrigerators and other household equipment, for clothes and things like that, out of a belief that that would in turn make us some kind of manufacturing powerhouse. And in the near term, it did create jobs. You know, we did have a bigger manufacturing sector than we might have done otherwise. But while we were doing that, we went from having the highest living standards in the world, measured by per capita income, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, to by the early 1990s ranking about 26th in terms of per capita GDP, being told by our own treasurer that we were on the way to becoming a banana republic. And so eventually we woke up to the fact that protectionism, as we practiced it for 90 years, was actually eroding our living standards and in particular acting as a drag on productivity. And as a result of abandoning that form of protectionism, and not only for that reason, of course, helped by the mining boom and our particular economic relationship with China, Australia went back from being 26th in the world in terms of per capita GDP in the early 90s to being about 12th to 15th in the world by the latter part of the 2010s. But it would seem that what we're doing now, if we were to persist with it, which I hope we don't, would amount to a rerun of that protectionism, whereby we force Australians to spend at home money that they would rather spend abroad if they were allowed out of the country. And that in turn creates jobs, including by preventing Australians who are competing for the jobs that are available from having to compete with migrants, as many people would have portrayed them doing for the last 15 or 20 years in particular.
So I can't help drawing the parallel between the lovely, secure sound of protection and the lovely, secure sound of stay safe, right? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is there's a trade-off between short-run benefits, which are kind of a mirage, and then long-term erosion of our competitiveness as a country.
Well, if we were to persist with these controls on movements across our borders, by this time next year, our economic performance will not look nearly as good relative to other countries who made different choices about vaccinations as it does at the moment.
I'm seeing a parallel between immigration and protectionism, which are both closed borders, and both were unlocked by Prime Minister Bob Hawke in the 1980s. That is to say, he began cutting tariffs to allow foreign goods to come in, believing this would stimulate the economy, get us spending on Australians, and he chose to rapidly ramp up immigration at a time of high unemployment, believing that this would actually boost the economy in the long term. And he was right on both fronts. So you're saying that there's only one issue, which is closed borders, whether they're expressed in terms of people or in terms of goods, and that in the short term, they're comforting, they're protecting, but in the long term, they actually hurt the economy, hurt living standards.
My view is that Australia's permanent migration program and the skilled component of our temporary migration programs do make a positive contribution, not simply to headline GDP growth, which of course they're mathematically bound to do, but also to per capita growth, and that they don't put downward pressure on wages, and they probably do create more jobs on net. But there is also, and I think this is what the Governor of the Reserve Bank was referring to, even though his position was mischaracterised by some others who have a particular point of view on this, I think what Dr. Lowe was saying was that there is also a significant element of unskilled temporary migrants coming into Australia. He made the point that in some industries, between 10 and 18% of the jobs being filled that don't call for skills are being undertaken by people who are on temporary visas. And I think he's right to say that that category of migration probably does put downward pressure on the wages of not only the unskilled migrants, but the Australians who are doing similar types of jobs. And it does serve to relieve employers of any obligation they might once have seen to train people. And while I'm absolutely not a supporter of winding back our permanent or our skilled temporary visa programs once the borders are reopened, I do think Dr. Lowe has made some significant points about whether we ought to be as willing as we have done to allow businesses to import unskilled workers to relieve temporary shortages, rather than the alternative of boosting the wages of those people and investing more in training them.
Gabriele, what do you think about that? Do you think that we should be maybe thinking again about how many unskilled workers we import?
I completely disagree with what Saul said to us at the end of that. I think the stuff that Saul mentioned about protectionism and stuff apply to migration, right? Like, we had a White Australia policy, we had massive campaigns of scaremongering against particularly Chinese migrant workers by labour movements in Australia. I think people tend to forget about just how vicious that campaign was. So we have had that kind of restrictionist, protectionist arguments applied to migration before. And I think time and again we've seen the benefits of migration in terms of being able to fill up areas of skills that Australians might not easily be able to get access to for whatever reason because of lagged training. And we've seen the benefits of migration through some of those cultural benefits as well. I think migration has been an incredible success.
Very quickly, can I ask each of you about the environment and infrastructure? And frankly, I get a bit sick of this. People say, oh, immigrants are crowding our cities. Well, you could say the same about tourists, right? You could say the same about foreign students who are cash cows. You could say the same about births. Yes, people crowd cities. But would our cities function better if we had fewer people?
I understand why people make that argument, but my view would be that the net benefits that migrants have brought to us, and not all of those are captured by economic figures. Migrants have enriched our culture and our society in ways that aren't measured in GDP. Some people would probably say they've created costs in terms of congestion and housing affordability that aren't measured in GDP as well, and I understand that point. But it would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, if we were to say that the solution to the undoubted problems that we have with regard to traffic congestion, pollution and housing affordability to which some extent migrants contribute. It would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we say we'll solve those problems by cutting immigration. There are other ways of addressing problems to do with housing affordability and with traffic congestion and with pollution that don't require us to give up the net benefits that we get from immigration, and that's what I think we should be pursuing.
Saul Eslake, Gabriella De Souza, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Head to the Economist's website for links to the latest thoughts about immigration from Saul, Gabriella, and the Governor of the Reserve Bank, as well as others.
Next week, inflation. It'll be CPI week, the Consumer Price Index. But what is it? How's it put together? And can we trust it? And might inflation be about to rise from the dead? Goodbye till then.
Bye-bye.